Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we are at the midpoint now of what's probably going to end up being a 6-part series. We're not exactly sure on the total, but it'll probably be a total of 6. And we're starting podcast number 4 in this short series. And we're talking about, based on the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses, we're talking about the archetypes that show up in our lives. Now, in the first 3 episodes of this short series, we talked about the goddesses in every woman. The ideas come from a book of the same name, Goddesses in Every Woman, by Jean Shinoda Bolen. And so in those 3 podcasts, we detail that out. You should go listen to it. If you haven't yet, you're going to need to do that to catch up to this podcast and the next ones we're going to do, right? So go listen to that. It's going to start building upon, because we're going to reference back to that in this podcast. Now, today, in this show, we want to talk about her other book and some of the concepts in that. Her book's called Gods in Every Man. So this is talking about the masculine archetypes that show up. And in this book, she details out some of the archetypes that are present in masculine energies, often showing up in men. They can also show up in women as well, but often showing up in men. And that's what we want to start down the road of today. Now, if you remember back to the last 3 podcasts, Bolen separates out the goddesses into 3 broad categories of virgin goddesses, vulnerable goddesses, and the alchemical goddess. And there's only one of them. So there's 3 in the virgin, 3 in the vulnerable, and 1 in the alchemical. In Gods in Every Man, in the book there's only 2 broad categories. There is a father god energy and a son god energy. And there's 8 god archetypes that fit into those, 3 in the father and 5 in the son that she talks about. So there's only 2 broad categories. We're still going to probably do this over a total of 3 episodes to make sure we get all the details in. But just know that it's broken up a little bit differently than the goddess book was broken up. This one has 2 of these different categories.
Right. And just to remind you that there's also a concept in, and this is all based on concepts around Jungian archetypes, since Bolen is a Jungian analyst. And she brings in this concept of the animus and the anima. The anima would be the feminine side of all men. And she recommends that when you listen to all the feminine archetypes in those goddesses, that if you identify as a man, you will probably identify with at least one of them as an anima. And then the opposite is true. If you identify as a woman, then when you listen to all of these archetypes, these masculine archetypes in the gods, then one of them, or maybe a couple of them, might be your animus. So for those of you who identify as women, when you listen to the series on Gods in Every Man, keep your ears open for which one could be your animus. Just like if you identify as a man, you probably were keeping your ears open for your anima in the goddesses' archetypes as well. So what's interesting about the differences between the goddess archetypes and the god archetypes is that there's different life cycles that are present in each one. And so I think because we've already established the goddesses, we'll probably do a lot of compare and contrast, right? between the 2 different styles to kind of understand how these all work. And for goddesses, we didn't mention this in the podcast, but in the book, I believe it was in the goddesses book, that she talks about 3 different life cycles that women have. And that is the girl life cycle, or the girl time period, the woman time period, and then the crone time period, or you could call it like the grandmother time period. Crone is not considered a very nice word anymore, but I think we should take that word back. I think we should reestablish crone as something that is a positive. And the girl archetype energy is most often seen in like a Persephone time period. And then she talks about, I think in a completely different book, what it looks like to be a quote unquote mature woman, or go into that crone or grandmother time period for the goddesses as well, because that's like a different life cycle. But when you refocus back onto the gods are actually, or masculine archetypes are separated into 2 different life cycles as opposed to 3. The 2 life cycles being the son, right, or the younger time period, and then the father time period. And there's only 2 different life cycles or time periods that are really represented in a man's archetypical life.
Yeah, my suspicion for this is that men really do go through one life change, like biologically speaking. They grow up and they hit puberty, and now they have the potential to become a father, and this potential lasts all the way until they die. I mean, ostensibly a man could father children up until the day he dies at a very old age.
Right.
Whether that's mechanically possible or not for certain men, that's up for debate. But it's supposedly possible, maybe not probable. Whereas women go through menopause, midlife, and it changes the course of their life. Biologically speaking, they no longer can have children at a certain point, and they enter a different stage of their biology. And so it makes sense that women have 3 stages that they go through, and men probably only have 2 biological stages they go through. Now, there's obviously some research that men also go through somewhat of a midlife change and these things as well. But I think it's from a very zoomed out perspective. I think these are the categories we're looking at because of those reasons.
Yeah, if you see it like sort of distinctly biological, it is true that a woman goes through another life cycle of menopause, and then that's when she enters that kind of crone or grandmother phase, which is actually a very important phase. But she turns into sort of like the archetypical wise woman time period. And so, yeah, there's different life cycles I hate to use the word, I keep using the word life cycles, and I don't think that that's accurate, but like time periods of cycles.
Seasons of life, maybe?
Seasons of life, right, for the gods. And so having this concept of the sun gods and the father gods is kind of interesting because it indicates that there are some men who archetypically kind of almost always express father energy, even when they are children themselves and are sons themselves. There's still a father energy that they naturally gravitate toward. Whereas there are other men who gravitate toward sun energy, even if they are fathers or well into their life, they will still have the sun energy. So it's kind of fascinating that even though there are these 2 phases, sometimes the archetypical energy is just representative of a single phase, regardless of what phase the man is in his life.
The other interesting thing about how Bolen sets this up is when you look at the feminine archetypes, the goddess archetypes, these can be, like we talked about, seasons. Now, again, we talked about the masculine god archetypes having seasons, like almost a dichotomous season. But I want to come back to that word dichotomy here in a minute. With the feminine archetypes, it's almost as if there's seasons or cycles they're going through, and it seems very lateral. It seems very horizontal in the way it's presented. With the gods, the masculine archetypes, it seems to be set up very oppositional. So you have a dichotomous nature to it, almost like a chessboard. You have one side with one energy, the other side with a different energy. And in some ways, these energies are at opposition with each other. There's a tension point, almost a rivalry or a competition between these 2 energies of father energy versus son energy, where you don't really see that in the female archetypes. There's more of these are more distinctions of who the person is more than the characteristic of who they're not. Like, in other words, in the father-son energy, there's a lot of this diametrically opposed, like, energy of what you're not on the side of the equation you're on. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I think she also talks a bit about, I think it's kind of Freudian, actually. There's this whole concept of the animosity that men can have for their sons. Very, very like deeply repressed animosity, because they realize that they have given birth to their successor, regardless of whatever archetypical energy the man himself possesses. And she points to the, sort of like Uranus gives birth to Kronos, and Kronos kills Uranus. And then Kronos gives birth, or, fathers, not gives birth to, but fathers the, Zeus in this pantheon of Olympian gods. And he immediately tries to kill them, or at least hide them, or diminish them, or, send them away, because he knows that one of them is intended to dethrone him. And then that's what happens. Zeus comes back with his siblings and destroys Kronos. And so there's this idea that no matter how powerful a man is, he's always going to be succeeded by his son. And so there's a fear around that. And you can kind of see that when we talk about how the ego, our egos want to live. Like, that's like, we all live because we have a drive to live as living organic creatures. And at some point in our development as living organic creatures, we gave birth to this thing called the ego, which is self-referential and understands its own existence. And at a certain point, we realize that we're going to die, and our ego no longer, will no longer be around. And to each individual person, that's like the worst thing they can think of. It's like that's the greatest tragedy the universe will ever experience is my death, right? And we can't help it. That's part of the drive to continue living. And it's understandable that the ego would be the emergent of something that has a drive to live. It's the self-referencing and self-referential drive to be alive. And so what happens is that because we can't live forever, then our genes get passed on, right? Part of our ego continues to live by passing our genes onto our offspring. But because our ego is self-referential and sees it as sort of being identified differently from every other human being, then we have a tendency to want to put our egos into our kids, right? Like we download all of our stuff into their hard drive, and we hope that they'll be enough like us so that we'll feel like something about us, not just our genes but our personalities, we're also able to live through our children and our genetic offspring. And so then there's sort of this insistence on sort of making sure our kids are, and to some extent, replicating us and our experiences and the things that mean something to us. But we never forget that we're going to die probably before they do. And that they're an expression of us, but not exactly us. And that ego challenge, that challenge with our egos, recognizing our own imminent death, is played out oftentimes in sort of a father-son rivalry, which is that the ego wanted this son to carry the genetic offspring, and the ego wants the son to be a lot like the father, in the same way that all parents want their children to be little ego manifestations or expressions. But it is inevitable that the son will continue to live long past the father's maybe even usefulness, not just his death. And so he'll still be alive, but watching his son, carry out things that he no longer is capable of doing. And so there's a subterranean, almost animosity that ends up coming up. So who knows whether or not that plays out like literally in every single father-son relationship. But it does seem to be something that a lot of stories are told around. Stories throughout history and in lots of different parts of the world is this relationship that fathers and sons have. And so in this pantheon of gods and looking at all these father-son archetypes, that's a kind of a reoccurring theme that keeps coming up, is this relationship that men have to ego and to their own father energy and to their own literal fathers, and them making peace with their own father-son energy. That's a lot of the dance that's happening in all these archetypes.
As you were talking about that, the thought just came to me about in the animal world. I used to work at a zoo a long time ago. A lot of male animals will actually eat their young. I just thought it was a very interesting just piece of information, right? Like certain large mammals will eat their young because they're seen as rivals or whatever. Like it's kind of we can see it expressed in the animal kingdom as well as maybe in humanity and some of these archetypes that show up. It's kind of interesting to me. Let's talk about some of these archetypes though. Let's talk about the three father gods. Did you get a comment about the animals eating their young?
I don't. I just we're representing some of Bolen's concepts in her book, which are kind of interesting. But I also want to make a note that I feel like, and this might even be predictive, but I found Bolen's book of Goddesses in Every Woman a much easier read for me. I think it's because she is a woman and she's able to manifest, to sort of manifest some of these archetypes within her as well. And she sees it from the inside, but also she's a psychotherapist, or at least was a psychotherapist. I don't know how old she is or what she's doing with her life at this point. But at the time that she wrote these books, which was in the mid to late 80s, or actually early 80s, that she was a psychotherapist that could also not only embody what it's like to be a woman and have these feminine archetypes, but also observe her clients, right? People who came to her and these archetypes there as well. In Gods in Every Man, there are some elements of what she talks about that I depart from. And I think as we enter into the three father god energies, I think she's kind of hard on them, actually. I think that probably coming from the perspective of not just a woman, but also a second wave feminist in a time period where she probably would have been, I think she said she graduated in like the 40s or 50s from college. And so she probably would have seen, like she would have had firsthand knowledge of a very Mad Men time period, right? Where it was still kind of weirdly acceptable to SWAT secretaries' butts as they walked by, and a lot of things that were not good manifestations of a very patriarchal time period. And not to indicate that we're not still in a time period that is predominantly patriarchal. I think that that's not unfair to say that. And at the same time, we're in a very different social climate. We're in a time period of a lot of social change. And so our relationship to these things is going to be different. And I think her observation of a lot of these gods was in a time period where people didn't feel particularly empowered to do anything about it. And I think we're feeling increasingly more empowered as people to look at bad behavior and people in power structures and point it out and feel like there's something we can do about it. And so since we're in a different time period in history, I feel like how she sort of represented some of these father god energies was a little, was colored by her time period. And I think as we go through them, I feel like I want to give a more fair assessment of some of these energies, because I still think that the archetypical energies themselves are very important. I think that they are important in men. I think that they're important in a feminine animus. I think that they're important in society and they have a place. And I think that some unfair characteristics of them are understandable, and also I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense. So as we go through them, if you have read the book of Gods and Everyman, we're probably going to kind of divert a little bit from her philosophies on this, a little bit, or at least I will, because I think I don't know if she was totally fair with it. And at the same time, she also points at some very valid things, which I think we should also focus on. So anyway, if you have read the book, as we're about to go into the father energies, the father god energies, and you're like, hey, that's not what she said. It's like, yeah, it's kind of for a reason. I want to give a little bit more of a generous characteristic, or some more generous concepts around these energies.
So thanks for that, by the way. That's some caveats.
Yeah, there's the bookends at the beginning.
The father god energies are Zeus, which is also known as the sky god, Poseidon, also known as the god of the sea, and Hades, god of the underworld. These are the three gods we're going to talk about on today's show. And I'm going to go ahead and give some general things for each. We can talk about some of their challenges, some of their strengths, and then some of their growth strategies as well, if you identify with one of these archetypes. Now, one of the things that I don't think we depart from her book on this, but she does mention this in her book, that really there is one father god energy, ultimately, that's expressed in three faces almost, like three different like masks, if you will, or three different access points that we see from that single father god energy,
like manifestations.
Manifestations. And so these are she's talking about them almost as if they're complete separate archetypes. And after reading the book, how I choose to see it is this is actually the same father god energy that might show up for you, just expressed in a different way. So that's kind of the first, maybe a little bit of a departure from how Bolen takes this, but let's get into some of the actual gods themselves, and you'll be able to unpack what you think about it yourself. So the first god is Zeus, the sky god of the sky, right? And the story of Zeus, actually his two brothers as well, of Hades and Poseidon, is that their parents, Kronos and Rhea, had them, but Kronos was massively jealous with his children. He was assuming that they were going to grow up and overthrow him. So he began to, as they were born, swallow them whole and not allow them to grow up in the world. Well, Zeus's mother, Rhea, actually saved him from being swallowed. She swaddled a rock when he was born in a blanket, a baby blanket. So Cronus swallowed the rock instead of the baby, which was Zeus. And then as he gets older and becomes a man, he decides he wants to overthrow his father. And with the energy of Metis, another energy at this time, he basically gives his father poison, and he vomits up all his siblings. So now he's got his two siblings, Hades and Poseidon, at his side, and they decide, let's gang up on Dad, let's overthrow him, and we can set up our own kingdoms and realms. So they go and attack their father. The father's killed, Cronus is killed, and now Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades draw lots to divide up the world. Zeus gets the sky, and he's got Mount Olympus in the sky. He's looking down upon everything. Poseidon gets the sea, and Hades gets the underworld. So this is where Zeus starts out, right? Starts out as a sky god. And he's the god of lightning, rain. He provided the rain that made things grow. Zeus has many children. He fathers children with both goddesses and mortal women. Unlike his father and grandfather, who were also sky gods, Zeus departs from them in that he does have some compassion and protection for his children. So he's a little bit more of a compassionate god, and he takes care of and protects them in a lot of ways, unlike his father and grandfather, like I said. He also had a dark side, though. There was a little bit of incest. He allowed rape to happen on his watch. There was physical abuse and psychological rejection. So some of these things are, not good elements of Zeus. His symbols are the thunderbolt and the eagle. And his ethos is he liked to establish his realm. He was a sky god. The realm for Zeus was very important, the entire kingdom, quote unquote, right? And he did this through war, through marriage, through command and control, through his protection and provisions, keeping people dependent on him. These are how he established his realm over the world that he ruled. So these are the characteristics of Zeus, the god character. Now, if these are embodied by a man in his life, it might show up things like an alpha male. These characteristics like alpha male tendencies, wanting to found dynasties, like some kind of a family business that gets passed on to generations of children. This idea of family dynasties, this idea of, establishing realms in the business world. Sometimes it can manifest as talking heads, maybe in the media, someone who speaks from on high and says what they have to say and then hope other people listen and obey it. This is the type of man and energy that sees the forest over the trees. So looking more at the strategy, the entire forest, not really seeing the individual trees as much. Might makes right is some of this energy. So a force of will, if I want it to happen, I will make it happen through my force. And there is a fear of being targeted or a fear of being overthrown. So men that have this energy can have a sense of, oh my gosh, they're coming for me. They're going to storm the gates of the castle. My position as the sky god is threatened here, and that can create a lot of maybe anxiety or fear in men that embody this energy.
There's a show that just came out on HBO called Succession that feels like it is tailor-made to express what a Zeus archetype looks like.
It's a great show.
It's a really good show, and I think it's ostensibly supposed to be based on the Murdoch family. Like, is he supposed to be Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah, guys that owns News Corp.
Right, yes.
Fox News here in the United States.
Yeah, so it's like the story about this like media mogul family. And the dad is at an age where, he's recently had a stroke, and it's this idea of like who's going to take over the family business, but dad doesn't want to let it go. And the dad in that, played by Brian Cox, I think, is such a, I couldn't think of a better example of a Zeus character. And that concept of like wanting the dynasty and wanting territory and sort of taking what, like if he wants it, he takes it. I think all of these qualities are, they're the parts of Zeus that worry people. Because if you are under the protection of a Zeus, right, like you mentioned, one of the things about Zeus that's kind of nice, actually, is that he gets better than his predecessors. He's better than Cronus because Zeus is compassionate with his children where Cronus never was. And so what's nice about a Zeus archetypical character is that the fathers that have, if they actually have children and have this father god energy, they usually have a protective streak. But if you're not in their protection, it can be kind of scary because it feels like, it's like an open field. And just anybody could get gobbled up by this Zeus character. Now, of course, you can have Zeus archetypical energy without, or archetype, you can be of the Zeus archetype without actually having a dynasty or being a mogul. Like you can just be some dude who's got, a job and you just have this Zeus energy inside of you. But those are the stereotypes around it, which is why you could see why people would have kind of a suspicion around this energy. Like the energy itself could be a little threatening just being around it. She talks about how little Zeuses in homes oftentimes have a combative relationship with their parents because it's like they, come out of the hatch just thinking that they own everything and that they should be in charge. She says as they grow up, even from the time they have their very first job, they're looking around asking themselves, what would they change if they owned the place? And so there's this natural sense of almost like a sense of they're destined to be in ownership. They're destined to have territory and to be the person who's ultimately calling the shots.
I think it's hard to find in popular media, storytelling, and our culture positive views of Zeus, positive expressions of the Zeus energy. It's almost always shown as kind of like Frank Underwood in House of Cards, corrupt and dominant. And it also is shown like the guy in Succession, right? The Logan character in Succession from this family, Logan Roy. So it's hard sometimes to really see, and even in her book, and I would agree with this, the Old Testament God in the Bible, the Old Testament Jehovah God, has a very Zeus sky god energy where he commands things from on high in the clouds almost, and those commands are needing to be taken out. The orders are passed down to somebody and they need to be followed and obeyed. And if they're not, there's justice to be paid for that. And there's punishment and justice, and he expects to be obeyed and listened to in the Old Testament. So there's even in the Bible, which is ostensibly supposed to be a positive book, some don't see it that way, some do. Even in the Bible, the Zeus archetype in the representation of Jehovah in the Old Testament can be seen as a negative portrayal. So we were racking our brains to think of, is there any positive looking Zeuses in maybe popular media? And I go back again to the show Game of Thrones on HBO, and the character of Ned Stark that we meet in season 1 of this show, I believe, is a good representation, a positive representation of the Zeus archetype. He doles out justice himself. He's willing to follow through with justice if he calls for justice. He doesn't expect other people to carry that out. In fact, that's one of the ethics he puts forth in the first episode. He seems to take care of the realm that he's been in charge of. He seems to be fair-minded, and he seems to have the best interest of most of the people he's overseeing in his mind. He's thinking about the best interest of all these different energies. And yet, even in the best expression of him, there's a little dark side there where he's got one of his rivals' sons as a captor. Now, he's made him part of his own family, but he still has basically a prisoner in his home overall. And so you can even see in the positive expression that I just mentioned, there's still some of these traits in him that most people in especially modern society would look at and go, whoa, that is not cool, man. That is not cool at all. And yet that, I think, is some of what Zeus brings out, is inherent, baked into his characteristics are things that we don't like about his character or his expression as an archetype. It almost comes with, like, to have full Zeus means you're going to have some of these things that come along with it that aren't that great. And we can talk about some more of those, but I think that's really, that's something I want to bring attention to, because I think it's hard to see him outside of the negative things that he comes with, that energy comes with.
I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to have a sober opinion of Zeus, because there are elements of this archetype that make people a little uncomfortable. And especially, when you were doing the recap, and I think all of the Father God energies have at one point a part of their story where rape becomes like with Hades, it's like the only story we know about him is the rape of Persephone, which we talked about in the Vulnerable Goddess podcast from Persephone's perspective. And this idea of being, we talked a little bit about Zeus being like the father of all of these children with goddesses and with mortals. And he was a philanderer, and he would trick people. He would trick women into relationships with him or into having sex with him. And he would turn a blind eye to other people's rape sometimes. And we were trying to figure out, like, well, is that terrible characteristic of rape just part of this Father God story? What's going on here? And we have to, I think on some level, we have to sort of recontextualize what they're ultimately trying to indicate with these Father God energies by seeing them through the lens of, what would that mean as a character trait in modern society? Because, when we talked about Artemis, back in the Virgin Goddess podcast, we talked about her being basically murderous. And modern day Artemises aren't all murderers, right? That are merciless, that will go kill children just to protect their mother's honor, like she did with Niobe's children. So what was it about Artemis? Was it that Artemis women all have a murderous competitive streak inside of them? Or is it that they have a tendency to be merciless, and so they have to build their compassion and not be so driven to competition? If you look at corollary with these stories of the rapes, which are really quite disturbing, I mean, I say this as a woman, I'm sure it's disturbing to men too. But what really is being said here when the stories talk about that, from the time period where death and rape and murder and, things that are really kind of horrifying to a modern world are spoken about in kind of a cavalier way. So what's the recontextualization? And I think what it is this sense of entitlement. Like, I want something and I'm seeing it and I'm going to go take it regardless of whether or not I have permission to do so. And there's this idea of sort of expanding one's territory and assuming everything within that territory is yours, right? And that's part of that Zeus-like, that energy. Expanding territory is how companies get made and how families get made, and how extraordinary buildings get, like there's a lot of really amazing feats that come from this energy of ambition and wanting something bigger and taking in a bigger territory. But when it gets when it's wrapped up in that ego we were talking about originally, that concept of the ego, when it's all about the person themselves and they can't separate their idea of this territory that they've established, or the idea that they should just be able to take what they want. When it's fully wrapped up in their ego, that's when it becomes kind of dangerous. Not kind of, it can become truly dangerous. And we've seen this in politicians. We've seen this in companies that have exploited, parts of the planet and also people in many parts of the planet. And just, done kind of horrible things with a massive overreach, because there's this idea of like, I want it, so I'm just going to go take it. And I think the reason why Ned Stark is actually a really good expression of this, of the Zeus energy, is, it's supposed to be a time period where captors of war are necessary to make sure that you keep peace. So him having, what's the kid's name? He ends up being Reek. In the books, and in the show actually, but the Ironborn kid. Anyway, those of you who are Game of Thrones fans will remember his name. That was an insurance policy to make sure that the Ironborn on those islands, the Iron Islands, wouldn't come attack them again. And so
Theon Greyjoy, I just thought of it.
Thank you, Theon Greyjoy. So even like he's doing things that are a product of his time, but he also never questioned whether or not he deserved to be basically quote unquote king of the North. Like, he was effectively a steward of the North once they, made all of those kingdoms under one crown. But he never questioned whether or not that he was the rightful king of the North, basically, and that territory was his. And that's a very Zeus-like observation. But one of the things that he brought to it is, like you said, his opinion was that if you were going to execute somebody, you had to do it yourself. And you would never have somebody else carry out your execution, because you needed to feel the full weight of your behavior and actions. So he wrapped in accountability. And I think this is fundamentally sort of the difference between father gods and sun gods, is that the sun gods are all marked, and we'll talk about them in future podcasts, but the sun gods are all marked by a need for approval seeking. They're, in all of their stories, they're seeking somebody's approval, or they're at least looking to, say, in particular Zeus, to come get them out of predicaments or to give them permission to do certain things or whatever it is. But they all see that somebody else or something else is higher, on the hierarchy than they are. But the father gods and those who have father god energies as an archetype, they're not approval seeking. They're not looking for anybody's approval. The only approval they're looking for is their own, which is probably what makes them feel a little dangerous to other people, is that they are 100% on their own, sort of their own time, like their own approval. They're only answering to themselves. And if that character is not a good character, if that Zeus character is not a good person, then when they're checking in to see if they're supposed to be doing something, they're not checking in with anybody else. They're just checking in with themselves. And if it goes towards their, whatever their agenda is, then the answer is like, that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do, even if it's not. So what's great about Ned is that Ned had a code of conduct that was very important to him. He had integrity and duty. So even though he wasn't checking in with other people for approval on his behavior, when he checked in with himself, there was a sense of rigor about that. So positive Zeus archetyped men might not be looking for approval from other people. It might be, like basically self-contained. But if they're focused on accountability to themselves and a sense of integrity, a sense of duty, maybe even a sense of honor, and also sustainability. When you take in lots of territory, if you behave as a Mad King, and Ned Stark was part of a group of people who overthrew a Mad King, right? Mad King Ares in the movies, in the books, then he understood what could happen when somebody was in a position of power that was just doing whatever they wanted to and whatever suited them. And he saw that that was a fully unsustainable model because he was part of the overthrow of that kind of kingdom. So when a man embodies the archetypical Zeus energy, and I don't really know unless that is a point of growth for that person, whether it's a man who's entering that archetypical energy or a woman who this is her animus and she's entering this archetypical energy. In either case, unless it's something they're actively working on just to kind of get that part of the flavor in them, I don't really think that the men who have this as their primary archetype, I don't think it's a choice. It's just how they feel. Just kind of like all of us as women and those of us who identify as women, when we look at our goddess archetypal energy, I don't think we're really choosing that. That's just where we're landing. So when a man has Zeus archetypal energy, and he doesn't really feel like he needs to be accountable to other people, right? He's only accountable to himself, and that's just sort of how he feels. Then the path of growth for that Zeus character is to make sure that there is a sense of rigor in there about being of good character, because there's already going to be a sense of, and I hate to use the word entitlement, but it's like almost like a sense of ownership. Like you just kind of walk through the world kind of feeling like you own the joint. If you enter the world with this energy, it's probably not a choice, but what is a choice is how you're going to treat that sense of ownership. Are you going to be a person who feels like you are responsible to other people, right? Like the idea of that power coming along with responsibility as opposed to power coming along with corruption, because those are kind of the two different ways it can go. That concept of absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's one road. The other road is with great power comes great responsibility. And that's another road. So the men who have Zeus archetypical or archetypal energy need to be responsible to that sort of sense of intrinsic power. And what's tough about that is that Zeus is a sky god. So he tends to intellectualize everything. He tends to be sort of emotionally disconnected because he's looking out on high, right? He's looking from an aerial view. And that keeps him from being particularly emotionally connected to the choices and decisions he's making, which makes it even more important for Zeus to come down to earth on a regular basis, to engage directly with his choices. That whole idea of Ned Stark always being the person who did the execution. He knew that he needed to have a direct touch on his choices. Otherwise, he'd lose sight of the consequences of his actions. And so I think that's the important thing in the path of growth, is to not stay too much in the sky, to not stay too emotionally disconnected from the things that you're doing, so that when you are making choices that might have big ramifications, if you do have, say, people working for you or people who are carrying out, quote unquote, carrying out your orders because you're the person who's like in charge in some way, then ensuring that you don't lose sight of where those orders are going, and having like a sort of a finger on the pulse of your decisions. And in that way, there's a sense of accountability to yourself because you're getting real world feedback about what your choices are doing. So then your sense of conscience can be directly impacted by those choices, and then fundamentally having a sense of sustainability. Because if you create a context where it's all about you, that's not sustainable as we're seeing in the modern world. And I think the reason why I say that these energies are good and we need to be sober-minded about it is that we all need leadership. Like I would say that most of us complain about good leadership. And we know that we need leaders. And that Zeus energy can come from a man, it can be a feminine, or it can be a woman's animus. So the leadership doesn't necessarily have to be any specific person or gender or anything. But the Zeus energy is what a lot of leaders are tapping into. And that Zeus energy, it doesn't matter who it's being represented in, that person needs to be accountable to their choices and decisions. And they need to have that sense of sustainability on their minds, because the modern world is not really tolerating corruption for very long. We're dethroning people like crazy right now. And the reason why is because we're just not going to put up with it for much longer. But we are still looking for the good Zeus energy. We're still looking for capable, competent, sustainability-minded leaders. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to get rid of this idea of leadership and get rid of this idea of a Zeus-like energy, regardless of where it's coming from. We want to be open to the Zeus energy showing up in whatever package it shows up in, as long as it's also coming along with that sense of integrity and character.
This is all very well stated, what you just said. And I think this is where... in particular, this book by Bolen, I have a little bit of umbrage with. I have a little bit of resistance to how she characterizes the three father gods for this very reason, in that it's almost like these are problems to overcome, these energies. And it's my opinion that these energies can be expressed well, expressed in a positive way. And I don't think, if this egocentric part, first of all, I see the father gods, in particular, a very extroverted thinking, introverted feeling structure. So this is a polarity that I see from a typology standpoint. If you know about cognitive functions, in Myers-Briggs, for example, I see the father gods coming with a lot of extroverted thinking, or TE energy, backed up by introverted feeling, or FI energy. And it's a very interesting, from a perspective of extroverted thinking, seeing the realm before you and all the resource, and seeing people as resource. This makes sense, right? And then everything comes back to you in an introverted feeling way at the core of your ego, let's say, to where you seem to be the center point of the universe. And, you talked about how this idea of the self is the only validation. It's what do I think needs to happen? There's no outside checks and balances. And so this code of conduct is something that's really important. As well as, I think it's not a suppression of the self to say, well, I need to diminish. If you have this energy show up, one of these father god energies show up, it's not about diminishing that energy. It's about taking that energy and ensuring that it goes out to the entire humanity of your realm. So this idea of extending the self out is it's a very introverted feeling way of looking at it, but it's extending out yourself to other people. So you see yourself in other people to say, they are part of me, and you take into account all of humanity in that we are all together. It's not me and only what I want. It's what we want, me as the collective in a way. And this is a very introverted feeling way of projecting yourself out onto other people and then using that as a ballast as well as that code of conduct.
Yeah, it's kind of like the concept of unity mind, right? Like, I'm not really separate from everybody else. Everybody else is a part of me, and I'm a part of everybody else. And so we're all sort of unique, individualized expressions of humanity, but we're all kind of one thing. And so I agree. I think in the way that she talks about the father gods, I would say that she paints it very much almost looking like that polarity as well, the extroverted thinking or effectiveness and the introverted feeling or authenticity. And there are better and worse ways for those functions to show up. There are like ways where those functions can show up as sort of young and demanding, or as mature and, and building in order, or getting things done in behalf of a greater good. So there's two different ways that those can go. And you can see people in positions of power have a tendency to be on that polarity, and they have a tendency to kind of go one of those two directions, like the bad me-centric direction or the giving for the greater good direction. That's not to say that people who have a different polarity, if you're a personality type in the Myers-Briggs system that has a different polarity, like extroverted feeling or harmony and introverted thinking or accuracy, that you can't be one of these archetypes. But I think the way that's painted kind of talks about sort of the effectiveness, authenticity, ultimate battle of making sure that that one is checking in with one's conscience as opposed to simply checking in with one's ego desires. when it's making choices that have big impact in the world.
So if you look back into what Bolen says about Zeus and some of the growth that comes from him, or how he can grow, the energy can be grown. Often growth for Zeus, if it's a full 100% Zeus expression, comes through crisis. And it's basically a heart attack. So when I say heart attack, that could be done in two ways. A literal physical heart attack where something goes wrong in a man's life that's very Zeus-like, like maybe a death or an illness, or in the show Succession, the first episode starts off with Logan Roy, who's a very Zeus-like character, having a serious illness he comes down with. So it sets off this heart attack of some sort, a physical ailment, or it could be a heart attack of love, where the Zeus character out of the blue is struck by a romantic interest that so captures his heart, an Eros arrow strikes his heart, and he has a heart attack of passion and romance that gets him to reevaluate his sky god position and command and control position, the eagle eye of the world, right? And have to come down and be more sensual, more grounded. This idea of coming down to earth from the sky god position and getting more grounded could come through both getting reference to your mortality, that heart attack idea, or the passions and love and lusts you have. Waking up the desire in you can ground you as well. An energy can come in that you fall in love with, and this can also bring you into a growth stage. So it appears as if the Zeus energy, growth is forced upon Zeus. Zeus isn't out looking to grow himself as an energy. Like, hey, how do I grow today? It's something that through crisis becomes apparent. Oh my goodness, I need to do something about this. I've fallen in love with this woman who doesn't give me the attention back. What do I do with this? Or I have a physical ailment or illness that I've got to struggle with. What do I do about this energy as well? So these are the ways that growth can happen for Zeus.
Well, and I think what it really is getting in touch with an emotional aspect. And it doesn't have to necessarily be like a highly emotional, place. What it has to be is getting out of that distant space and into something that's more heart-centric. And for Zeus's, usually it does happen to them, but for those of you who are identifying with Zeus archetypical, I keep saying archetypical, I mean archetypal. For those of you, if you, the listener, identify with Zeus as an archetype, then, and you're also into personal development, then it would be things that get you more in touch with your own personal humanity, things that get you in touch with more of your heart space. Not being so judgmental, not being so distant, maybe fostering, like if you're a parent, fostering more intense and sort of personal relationships with your children, not just the kind of relationship, like Zeus has a tendency to create relationships with his children where he's giving them a lot and he's financially supporting them. But a path of growth for a Zeus energy is to also emotionally support and find a more like sort of a tender, vulnerable place, which oftentimes Zeus energy thinks is foolish. But being willing to be foolish, being willing to be vulnerable is a path of growth. So if you're identifying with this as a man, and this is your archetypal energy as man, or if you're identifying with this as an animus, if you're a woman, you're identifying Zeus as your animus, then vulnerability is a path of growth for you.
Yeah, and getting in touch with the emotional aspect of yourself, because Zeus is very emotionally stable, right? He's got when I say stable, I don't mean he can have bursts of anger or passionate moments, but overall, it's a pretty stable energy over the long term. Like the spikes on the heartbeat chart aren't going to go up and down wildly. It's going to be a couple of those every once in a while, but mostly a clean, flat line of stable emotion for whatever that emotional thermostat setting is. However, we're going to talk about his brother, the god archetype of Poseidon, who is almost the exact opposite emotionally. So Poseidon is the god of the sea. He's got the same, basically a very similar creation story to Zeus. He's born to Cronus, and he is actually swallowed along with his siblings, and he's vomited back up. And when he and Hades and Zeus divide up the world, he gets underneath the sea, underneath the ocean. He's the god of water, and water can metaphorically also mean emotions. It's linked metaphorically to instinct, emotion, passions that are stirred up. Not just passions being stirred up, but passions overwhelming his personality. He can barely contain fits of rage or intensity of lust, or this is like almost imagine the God version of somebody gets in bar fights all the time. This is the guy that does it, right? This is the energy that does it. He is very much pictured like Zeus, the big beard, very father god archetype looking, except he's holding a trident. So it's that three-pronged basically weapon that he carries with him. You ever seen the movie The Little Mermaid? Her dad in the movie The Little Mermaid, the Disney movie, is supposed to be Poseidon holding his trident. So just imagine that, the cartoon picture, if you will. That's kind of how he's pictured often and depicted. Very bad-tempered, violent, vindictive, dangerous. So these are some of the characteristics of Poseidon, already sounding like a pretty rough guy. He was also a womanizer, a philanderer. He cheated on his wife. He would have different affairs and have different children with all sorts of different women, both goddesses and mortals. And often some of his children end up as monsters or very dark creatures, or very much having bad characteristics, much like himself. So his children had very similar characteristics to him. They were very fierce in their temperaments. So symbolically, he can also be sometimes depicted as a bull or a horse, but the symbol of the trident that Poseidon carried matches up to, it's basically the masculine father version that correlates with the cycles of a woman's life. So that maiden, mother, crone we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast, that trident matches up to those. There's three parts of the masculinity that go along with the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And this was a symbol of fertility, and the overarching symbol, it's a very phallic symbol that he can impregnate greatly, right? This is kind of the idea or concept there. The emotions, though, for Poseidon, the ethos of him, his emotions are actually very repressed. As they stack over time, they explode in rage or grief. So it's almost like the surface of the water, the calm of the ocean, right? It's very still water. Underneath, there's something brewing, and then all of a sudden it explodes out of the water, and it's this force to be reckoned with, this explosive energy of rage or grief or some kind of strong emotion that, quote-unquote, washes over a man when he's embodying this archetype, right? It's overwhelming his entire psyche. Oftentimes, the ethos of a Poseidon man is driven to be somebody important. Unlike a sky god, he doesn't feel like he's got what it takes, and he actually doesn't, to establish a kingdom. He's very eye for eye, tooth for tooth, justice seeking. If you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. So this idea of a very hot-headed, emotional under the surface, explosive in anger or grief when triggered after stacking those emotions for a while, this is a very explosive character that we're talking about here in Poseidon. Now, there's not all bad characteristics with this archetype. There is a capacity for deep loyalty and emotional depth that comes with the Poseidon archetype. So there's this sense of being able to get into the emotions, the deepest levels of emotional expression in the human psyche that Poseidon can really get into. There's this emotional depth, this connectivity with emotion, the capacity for loyalty to somebody, this idea of a connection using emotion. I would say that Hollywood has a high representation of men that have this archetype, that especially in positions of being director or producers, they tend to have the desire for emotional expression and maybe not the direct capacity for it themselves. So it simmers under the surface, and they employ actors and writers and other people to act these things out, but they're still drawn to that industry. This is just an example of one of the industries I can see this in. And they can be very much like a godlike archetype, right? Their dominion of their studio or their production is their realm, their dominion. And then all of a sudden explosions can happen on set, or someone can get really upset, or they can, have outbursts of anger or frustration at the actors not doing something like that, that they want done. So I think that you could probably find this archetype in that industry, whereas the Zeus archetype you're going to find more in like banking and finance and big business. If you're looking at as a god energy in an industry, I think that Hollywood would be probably a really good, and maybe even the music industry would probably be two places you'll find this more often than not, because it's drawing that emotional part of them toward it.
Yeah, more the arts. Yeah, exactly, and more emotional spaces. I mean, you went through Poseidon, and I think you were being faithful to Bolen's caricature of Poseidon, but I think she's kind of unfair to him. I think she paints him in a really negative light. And I actually, as we were talking and going through all of this, and maybe this is just me being self-protective, but I realized I think I actually have Poseidon as an animus. Like, I really identify with him, because when I really think about my masculine energy, it's not really approval seeking. So I was like, well, it's very not approval seeking. So it's probably one of the father gods, but I don't really identify that much with Zeus. And we'll talk about Hades in a moment. I don't really identify much with Hades. And I realized that when I have like sort of a pull on my full power, it tends to be a bit sort of emotionally intense. And so I look at Poseidon in a bit more of a positive light, because I feel like I really embody Poseidon as an animus a lot. And I think Bolen characterizes him in sort of very, I don't think she's very generous. She sees this, she acknowledges that men can have a hard time of it if they're given sort of those stereotypical, sort of anciently stereotypical messages that you're not allowed to be emotional as a man. And so if a Poseidon archetypal man is raised in an environment that says, boys don't cry, then it's going to be a very difficult situation for that person to not have sort of subterranean anger, like that emotion sort of under the surface. And if they're raised in a context that does give them permission to be emotional, I don't see any reason why a Poseidon archetype can't, instead of suppressing all of that emotion, channel it into something creative. And she talks about that later in the chapter. She talks about developing, say, maybe a Hermes archetype for creative expression. But I don't know if a Poseidon, archetypal man, or a woman maybe like me who has Poseidon as animus, I don't think that they necessarily need to pull on all these other gods or goddesses to be complete. I mean, all of us do. We all need to balance out all of these archetypes, but to some extent. But I think that Poseidon himself has like a really positive gift in that he's able to be in touch with his emotions and not necessarily attach it to approval to others, which means that Poseidon, more than any other god, taps into his own authentic emotional expression. And it can go awry. It can go into an egocentric place where he's a blustery guy and is emotionally, like not emotionally expressive, but rather emotionally volatile, and takes what he wants because he's a father god, so he has a tendency to want to take in territory and all of that. And also, just like Zeus's power can go the path of responsibility and accountability as opposed to corruption, I think Poseidon's emotional connectivity and his connection to emotion can go to a place of giving or reminding men that you can be masculine and emotional at the same time. Like maybe traditionally that kind of guy repressed himself to a point where it always showed up in this sort of, swaggery sort of, I hate to say it, but this sort of dick swinging, macho guy. Like there was probably a time when Poseidon energy had a tendency to head that direction. And then I think now there's a little bit more space for Poseidon men to tap into that emotional energy and channel it for positive. My dad had a very good friend who, as soon as I read the chapter, I immediately thought of this gentleman who my dad was very good friends with, who, like in the Myers-Briggs system, was an ESFP, and he was a bodybuilder back before it was a thing, right? Way back before like gym memberships were all the rage. He built a gym in his garage, and he always worked out, and he was a logger, and he had this really masculine father energy, but he was incredibly, like you talked about the loyalty piece, he was incredibly loyal to his wife. He would have killed himself before he did anything to hurt her. And he was a guy who would cry. Like when he felt the need to cry, he did. And he got touched by things, and he was emotional, but nobody ever questioned his masculinity. Like he was a very masculine guy. And I think he gave other men around him permission to express emotion. He was one of the earliest examples I can think of that in my life as somebody who didn't compromise any masculinity while at the same time being emotionally expressive. And to me, he's like a really positive example of Poseidon. He was a great father to his children. He was a very loyal husband. He was a really good, solid human being and a hard worker, and nobody questioned that father energy. So I feel like Bolen's just a little hard on Poseidon and kind of an unfair sort of mischaracterization. But I also think of people, and you mentioned this when we were talking about, people who could potentially be Poseidons. You even mentioned that you were thinking that
Steve Jobs
could have been a Poseidon, and that kind of makes sense.
Kind of a father energy. He seemed to have a lot of emotional outbursts when things didn't go his way, and he had a lot of intense emotion and wanted to channel that. He obviously channeled into Apple and building all the products at Apple that he built, or that he had Apple build. He didn't do them himself, right? But he was definitely the guy in charge, and you didn't mess with him, and he had a lot of passion. And then he bought Pixar as well and built Pixar up. Is this idea of going to the arts, creating something artistic, but doing it through a very dominant top-down structure. It's going to be his way or the highway. And he had emotional outbursts and explosions of anger or grief or frustration if things didn't go the way he wanted them to go. So, yeah, I feel like he's a potential expression in a human of that archetype.
Well, and what's so fascinating about that is, I don't know if he's like the best example of a Poseidon, because I think you probably could have gotten some of that emotion under control, but it was also attached with a searing vision of something that he wanted to build, which I don't know if you're a Steve Jobs fan or not, you listening, but you can't deny that he was a pretty powerful force in the universe, or at least in this little rock in the universe that we're on. And Bolen talks about how Poseidon is almost always like sort of the brother that lost to Zeus, like that kind of takes a second stage, or he plays second fiddle, and that's part of his perpetual insecurity. But I don't necessarily see Poseidons as perpetually insecure. I see some of them on a mission. And so I think Poseidon, some would argue that Steve Jobs had more of an impact on humanity than, name any Zeus running any company. Like Poseidon, if Steve Jobs is that archetype, may have had one of the biggest ripples in our lifetime. And so I think Poseidon can be a very powerful and positive character, not just an exploitative, I want this, so give it to me, and I'm going to throw a temper tantrum characterization. So again, I think when we look at these father energies, and in the spirit of radical honesty, this might be one of the most difficult of all of these in this series to record, because we're in a time period right now where I think masculine power in particular is seen through a lens of some suspicion. And we're trying to be careful right now to remind people that these archetypes can also manifest in women as an animus. Or like we keep trying to reference that so that people remember that these qualities aren't just seen in men. They're seen in, people who identify as all, like both genders and whatever comes in between, right? Whatever you identify as, you can have Zeus energy. And during a time period of suspicion of masculine power, which I do feel like we are in a bit of a social climate around that, to remember that these leadership qualities, no matter who they're expressed in, is still important. I'm probably going to keep harping on this because I think that these leadership qualities are very important, and we need good leadership. And so these energies that sort of represent in our collective unconscious this concept of leadership, I think we need to remember how positive they can be and how much we desire them when they do show up in a positive way in the leaders that we choose.
I would agree with you. This is a challenging one for us to record because of some of the things you mentioned. And as you were talking, it came up to me as well. I feel like Bolen in her book put us in a position that I was put in as a Christian when I had to read the Old Testament. And I had to go out and I had to basically in the Old Testament, God, the idea, Jehovah, God was doing terrible things and allowing certain things to happen. He was ordering people to wipe out entire populations, or somebody that was his faithful follower, Lot, was supposedly in honor of God and his angels that came to visit him, giving his daughters to be raped. And I had to go out as a Christian and basically run cover for this God who is, had some pretty bad behavior. And I feel like Bolen's putting us in a very similar position with how she's characterizing all these archetypes. It seems to be only the negative traits so far in the father gods, and we're having to go, but totally, it's not just all that. It's kind of, there's some good stuff too. And I think that this is where I depart from Bolen's book a little bit, is I think she is characterizing these energies in a very specific lens, a worldview that she has, that as someone who identifies with a lot of these father god energies myself, I take umbrage with how she's characterizing them. I'm trying to be careful and trying to be sober-minded and fair-minded. And yet I look at this and go, man, it does, I don't think there's just a suspicion of father god energy on the planet. I think sometimes there is some hostility toward it. I can definitely feel that, having this energy in me, coming from various people and various energies in the world. So, I kind of feel like we're put in a position very similar to how I was put in a position in my old Christian days, defending a God who made indefensible actions in the Old Testament, basically.
Yeah, or like two she-bears coming out and killing a bunch of teenagers.
Yeah, it's just like
for calling Elijah
stuff, right?
bald head. Well, and I mean, if you're listening and you're a Christian, we can sympathize with the situation you're in, because we're kind of doing that, like you said. We kind of feel like we're in a situation where we're running cover for these gods, but they're not actual people who existed, right? Like Zeus never existed, and Poseidon never existed, and Hades, who we're just about to talk about, never existed. But they're archetypes that we do see that run throughout people. Like they're types of people who we see come up over and over and over again. So I don't think that we're going to wash it out of society. I don't think we're going to get rid of these archetypes. Like they've been around in our collective unconscious for a very long time, and they're probably going to stick around for a really long time too. I mean, who knows where these archetypes will eventually evolve to, because I think everything evolves over time. One nice thing about talking about these father god energies is, like we mentioned, that Zeus was a better version of a father than Cronus was. And actually, I think she even makes an argument that Cronus was a better father than Uranus, his father, was. And so we see, even in our collective unconscious around these father gods, we see an evolution over time of greater kindness being expressed. And I think that at this time period, I believe that those of us that identify with these father energies, like we're at a time period where we can express even greater kindness through them. So, keeping the leadership qualities, keeping that desire to be responsible, keeping that, but then also imbuing it with a little bit more kindness and rationale, and not that sense of sort of greedy take. I think that I think over time we're going to do a better and better job of that's the evolutionary process we'll be going toward.
Let's talk about Hades, the god of the underworld. Now, Hades, again, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, gets swallowed by Cronus, vomited back up, and then he helps his two brothers take over and kill their father. When the lots are thrown, he gets the underworld. And now Hades is the name of himself, and the underworld he occupies, which is called Hades. He's also sometimes referred to as the invisible one. Hades was the realm of the unconscious, and Zeus and those on Mount Olympus feared Hades as sky god values became dominant in the world. So when Zeus's energies and the ideals of a sky god archetype became more dominant in the world, Hades became more negative and feared. For example, at one time, the underworld wasn't seen as so dark and terrifying. And as time went on, as culture kept moving on, this idea of hell and hellfire got projected onto Hades. And it became a very dark, dangerous place of death and something to be feared and be steered away from. The more and more the sky god energy was put forth and projected into the world, this depth of Hades was becoming very much to be avoided. Hades doesn't have a lot of mythology. He has no children, so he did not sire any children at all. And he doesn't have a lot of mythology. The biggest mythological story of Hades is the abduction and rape and imprisonment of Persephone. So Persephone is out with her friends playing in the forest. She gets distracted by a narcissus flower. And then she gets abducted by Hades in the midst of being distracted by this narcissus flower. And she gets drugged to the underworld where she's raped and imprisoned, right? And then the story goes on from there where basically Demeter, her mother, stops giving fertility to the world. Like things start to dry up and die and everything's really bad. So Zeus is like, all right, Hermes has got to go get Persephone out of the underworld, bring her back up to Demeter, and let's set things right. And then she eats the pomegranate seeds, and now she's a captor of Hades for a portion of the year. She goes back to the underworld, where she ultimately becomes queen of the underworld. And again, if you haven't listened to the podcast where we talk about this in the podcast called The Vulnerable Goddesses, 2 episodes ago, where we detail out Persephone's story. But we're talking about from Hades' side this time, where he abducted her. He saw she was vulnerable. He desired her. He abducted her, raped her, and then imprisoned her, and basically made her his wife. And this is who he ended up marrying. Again, no children came from this union, but as queen of the underworld, Persephone would spend time with Hades in Hades together. They would be there for portions of the year. Hades' ethos, he's a very recluse persona, or very recluse energy, I should say, because he actually doesn't have a persona. One of the characteristics is he doesn't have a lot of personality. His persona is weak. If you remember our conversation about Hestia, it's more of an energy than it is a person. Hades is a person, but it's got a lot of just a low-grade persona, not a very dominant or forceful will or person that he comes up with. He's often referred to as invisible. He doesn't feel seen, and often depression or the shadow world or the personal collective unconscious can be seen as Hades if we see that in our own life. A man who embodies Hades in life and work, again, can be very recluse around men, maybe not very good with women. You're not a player at all, not somebody that understands how the social like male-female dynamic works, probably doesn't have a lot of male friends, stays much to himself. He can be deeply connected to somebody, though, if he finds a soulmate. So somebody that really connects with him deeply, he can find himself very much connected with them, whether it's a man just as a friend or a woman in relationship or a man in relationship for that matter. There can be this deep sense of soulmate bonding. Also can have a very rich fantasy life, imagining scenarios and situations with people, often people that he sexually desires. So he might, one of the characteristics here, anecdotally could be in the office, someone is kind or friendly to him. Maybe a woman is friendly to a Hades man, and now this Hades man goes home and for the next 3 weeks starts imagining all of these romantic scenarios, falls vicariously in love, with this woman at work, and has constructed this big story of how interested she is in him when she was just being friendly, right? But he's got all this rich imaginative world, and then can come and make expressions of that romance, assuming the woman's on board. Then she matches his internal imaginations and experience, and here that's not the case. There's nothing to reciprocate that. It was all in his mind that he constructed this romantic narrative. Often he can struggle being a loner, having some inferiority complexes. People don't understand him often, dealing with depression, and again, like I said, distorting reality through his own imaginations, through that introverted imagination he has, where he can build up things that aren't true based on very little pieces of evidence in the outside world. So this is the Hades archetype as a masculine energy that can show up for another father god. Now, the reason he's called a father god is because he's the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, even though he didn't actually father children himself. He was still of that generation, and he also controlled a realm, and that was the underworld. So there was this sense of father energy from him, even though he did not actually have children himself.
Yeah, Hades, again, I think that Bolen's a little hard on Hades, but I think that she's a little hard on all the father gods, as I've mentioned before. But like you mentioned, Hades is kind of like Hestia in the sense that there's not a lot said about him as a person. It's more understanding the realm that he's in charge of, since the word Hades means, like, it's both his moniker, it's his name, and also the name of the territory that he occupies. So there's, like you mentioned, the abduction of Persephone is the only story that we really see Hades take action and behave in any specific way. And we know a lot more about Persephone from that particular tale than we do him. So we kind of have to extrapolate things about Hades based on the realm itself as opposed to character traits, kind of like we did with Hestia. Hestia didn't have a lot of characteristics herself, but she was the goddess of the hearth. And so we extrapolate things about her from her position and how she was worshipped. And so with Hades, we have to extrapolate a lot about Hades from how he was worshipped. And as a god of the underworld can mean, like you mentioned, it can be a specter of death. It can reference anything that's dying. And we have a tendency to fear death. But if you see it in terms of it as a metaphor, and even things like, in tarot, people will get like the death card and they'll go, oh no, somebody's about to die. But really the death card in tarot is referencing the completeness of something. And so death can be scary to us, but it's really, it's something that causes us to think in terms of significance. Like the fact that we're going to die, it's been posited a lot that because humans are aware of their mortality, there's a depth to us. Like we think in deeper terms because of it. We understand significance and meaning more because of it. And so Hades is that introverted quality inside of us that understands significance and depth. It's connected to the unconscious, both the collective and the individual unconscious. So those people who are willing to do a lot of introspection, go real deep, ask significant questions about themselves, are usually evidencing more of a Hades characteristic.
And I would just make a quick distinction here between the emotional depth that Poseidon can access. This is more the psychological or shadow depth, almost in Jungian terms, right? That we can access through our psyche. It's different than the emotional depth that we're talking about with Poseidon.
Yeah, if you were going to look at it in Jungian cognitive function terms, Poseidon would be more of like an introverted feeling position, or maybe extroverted feeling sometimes in its emotional expressiveness. Whereas Hades would be more of like an introverted perceiving function, like introverted sensing or introverted intuition, where it goes in and explores its own mind, and and especially with its unconscious mind, which we tend to here at Personality Hacker sort of associate that with introverted intuition. So those of, if you are identifying with the Hades archetype, you probably are introverted, and you're probably leading with an introverted perceiving function. So that would make you probably an IJ. And the Hades sort of natural tendency to withdraw and go inside and sort of create these imaginations. You mentioned the idea that, and you're basically talking about how Bolen mentions that a Hades man can have this rich inner fantasy world that he's applied to maybe a woman who was nice to him. And I think that that's probably sort of like the worst way that a person can talk about a rich inner terrain, right? Like when I think of a rich inner terrain, I don't think of a man who's creating a fantasy around somebody who was nice to him. I think of like J.R.R. Tolkien creating all of Middle Earth in his mind before he was able to write the Lord of the Rings and the Lord of the Rings series, and then also the Hobbit series, or the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is an extraordinary feat of internal world building that happened from a very rich inner imagination. And there's a lot of complicated themes that run through it, a lot of themes around death and loyalty and, basically the drama of humanity in our collective unconscious is in large part expressed through these books and through the world building that Tolkien made. So I think a more generous perspective of a Hades archetypal individual is this idea of like a complicated, rich inner world that to some extent can be a little schizoid, right? Separated from others. So rich and in depth inside the mind that when this person visits the outside world, it's almost colorless in comparison, if that makes sense, right? It's like, it's never as interesting out there as it is in here, so why would I venture out? And when I venture out, there can be pain out there because I understand my inner terrain, because that's my domain, right? As a father god energy, it's all about territory. For Zeus, it's like a territory expansion that usually shows up in an externalized way with like building something or gaining more territory through real estate or something to that effect. For Poseidon, his territory is the ocean, which is represented in emotions. So a Poseidon might gain more physical real estate territory if they choose to, but it's actually more territory of influence and art and expressiveness and emotion, right? The territory, I think, is far more about sort of emotional influence for a Poseidon than it is necessarily physical, tangible real estate. And for Hades, the territory is the inner world, the inner domain. That's the territory of the underworld. And so there's a lot in there. There's a lot to explore inside the human psyche. So it's not surprising that Hades men have a tendency to go into like writing and literature and history and I think psychiatry and psychology is very much part of this domain as well. And being willing to touch on things that other people find macabre or too disturbing. Like, I mean, I would assume and imagine that Edgar Allan Poe was probably a Hades, and he wrote extraordinary works that allowed us to get in touch with parts of humanity, even though I don't know if he was somebody who used an introverted perceiving function. His Hades archetypal nature had us touching on, those of us who read his works, touch on elements of humanity that maybe we don't really want to go visit. But here it is, and now we have to contend with it, and now we understand ourselves better. So I think of Hades as leading, just like Zeus and Poseidon does, but he leads in a very different way. His leadership frame is bold, going through really complicated psychological experiences. There's a boldness to being willing to lead in entering places that other people get spooked by, right? Here be dragons, and he's willing to go look at those dragons. And there's more of a leadership frame in that way.
So Bolen talks about some growth strategies for Hades. She talks about this idea, that he doesn't have a persona necessarily. He's more of a energy, or he shrinks back from a strong personality. And so some of her recommendations are creating some type of an interface with the world, a stronger persona. She even talks about a mask, wearing a mask to be able to interface and be acceptable to society and the world. And then she also talks about how to basically partner up with a Persephone in your life, if you're a Hades archetype, that can be the interface of the world for you. So it can be the persona or the mask. If you can't do it yourself, maybe this other person can be your social calibrator and help you through the world. And also developing the god of Hermes, which is the messenger god, which we'll get to in a future podcast. So that was Bolen's recommendation for growing Hades, and I'm like, okay, I read that, and I go back, take that for what it is. If you identify with Hades, some of those growth ideas, and again, in Bolen's book, she's got those outlined. So definitely pick up a copy of this. It's definitely worth a read. But I come all the way back to what we talked about at the very beginning, where it's my belief, and Bolen references this at the beginning of her book, that out of the father god archetypes, those three expressions, it's really the same energy or persona or being, I guess, that's expressed in three faces or three different ways, three different expressions of it. This idea of Zeus, the sky god, Poseidon, the water god of emotion, sky god of intellect, water god of emotion with Poseidon, and then Hades, the god of the unconscious or the underworld. And I see it from my perspective because I identify with a lot of the energies of all three of these god archetypes. I see them as complementary to each other to help cover their own blind spots. So what I mean by that is, what I see as a path of growth, you probably, if you have this father god energy, are going to express in one of these ways as your primary way of expression. So you might express as a Zeus, but you're going to have some Poseidon and some Hades. You might express as a Hades. You're going to have some Zeus and Poseidon. You're going to express as a Poseidon. You're going to have access to Zeus and Hades. So if one of these three energies is showing up for you, I believe balancing out the other two energies in the father archetypes will be beneficial for you. For example, I identify very strongly with all three of the father god archetypes in various ways in my life. And I also identify with Hermes and a little bit of Apollo, and we'll talk about those in a future podcast. But I definitely identify strongly, and I think I have a lot of Zeus characteristics. And by identifying with Zeus, one of the ways that I found I can grow is getting more in touch with the emotional side of my psyche, right? And this was part of my growth, even in the Myers-Briggs system, growing my introverted feeling process as my co-pilot, which we always talk about here at Personality Hacker, going to your co-pilot. And that was a very emotional place for me, that very Poseidon-like, getting into the depths of emotion, finding out what's under the surface emotionally. What am I actually processing there? And working through that. And then also growing parts of myself that are deeply under the surface unconsciously. Like these are parts of me in the Hades realm that I grew and got in touch with. Okay, what do I actually feel at the depths of my psyche? How do I use that feeling terms, but what am I perceiving? What is my unconscious telling me? And these have been growth parts for me, expressing all aspects of that father energy and that archetype showing up in not just the one expression, but all three expressions.
Yeah, there's almost like a trinity here of three different energies in one. But I do think that men who have one of these father god energies or archetypes as their primary are going to, even though I do think that there's like a single energy sort of almost fractured into three, I do think that most people will identify with just one of these elements more than the other two. And I would agree that there's like a balance in all of these. These are all just kind of, I mean, they could also represent, sort of the heart, the mind, and the unconscious, or the deepest parts of who we are. And I think that having a balance of all of those, no matter who you are, it's ideal to be able to head that direction. So did you have more you wanted to say on Hades, by the way?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, so I think as we wrap up, and this is probably a really long podcast, I'm realizing we spent a lot of time here. And as we mentioned, of all 6 of the podcasts that we're going to do in this series, this is probably the toughest one. As you mentioned, it almost feels like we had to defend this father god energy, and maybe we didn't need to. Maybe it's a perfectly acceptable archetype in a lot of people's minds, but it kind of feels like these archetypal energies are a bit under attack. Or when they're expressed in such an aggressive way that it's hard to remember that there's really positive elements to them. And I would argue that the positive elements are the leadership components that are expressed. Because the father god energies seem to not seek approval from the outside world, there's an inner spark, an inner fire towards leadership that even like the Hades has, but he's leading to a different place. He's leading to the underworld. But regardless, I think we're always clamoring in society for better leadership. We're always trying to figure out who would be a really good leader. And we become disenchanted with leaders who have allowed the power to go to their heads, or who aren't working on themselves and becoming better versions of themselves, that do allow themselves to go Poseidon-like in rage or temper tantrums, or allow themselves to get disconnected from the results of their actions like the Zeuses, or just sort of seem to almost be disappearing acts like the missing leaders, like a Hades can do. If we remember that this energy, the greatest gift that this energy can give us as individuals and then kind of collectively as society, are those really positive leadership qualities. As long as it is, again, attached to sustainability and accountability and a sense of good quality character, then these are very highly desirable traits in both a man who has a father god energy as their primary archetype, or in a woman who has a father god energy as her animus. So these are good ones to develop. If this isn't your natural, if this isn't your natural archetype that you sort of is native to you, there are things about these archetypes that are very positive for developing. And I would say that lack of desire for approval, right? Like we all kind of given this sort of this propaganda about, well, don't care what anybody else thinks, just follow your heart, or do what's right for you, or do what makes sense for you. That's us encouraging each other to go towards a father god energy, to self-approve, to answer to ourselves and our own sense of integrity and conscience, and answer to our own core values, and not really have to care about what other people think. That's that's all represented in that Father God energy or those archetypes. So everybody, I think, could stand to develop at least a little bit of this. And then those of you and those of us, right, who have it as a primary archetype or animus, then remembering to be, to honor it, to not let it overpower you, to be in control of the archetype piece, that energy, and to do it for service and for good and to be accountable. Again, that concept of sustainability. You can't just take, right? Like we have to remember that there are certain sort of principles to the universe. That means that if we take, we also have to give. And the best way to create territory, the best way to have leadership and have bigger frames is by having people want to follow you. And people want to follow good leaders. So if this is your archetype, then being a good leader is the best way to have the territory you desire.
I think the final piece of this too is this idea of down to earth, meaning look at the gods and the realms the father gods, the three of them, and the realms they occupy. We have the sky, Mount Olympus in the sky. We have under the ocean, and then we have the underworld. And there's not a lot of God representation or Father God energy representation on the surface of the earth. Again, this is all in metaphor, but think in terms of if you identify with one or more or all of these Father God archetypes and these energies, remember that you need to come up from the surface, from the underworld, or from the surface of the depths of emotion, get onto land, and actually get real with what's going on. If you're a sky Father God energy, like Zeus, come down to earth, off Mount Olympus, and get real with what's going on. I think that if you can make your leadership and your Father God energy real and tangible and bring it down to basically pragmatism, to application. I know I'm, again, still talking in abstracts here, but think in terms of what this might mean for you. I'm leaving it abstract because I don't know you as personally as I'd like to at some point in the future. But I'm just giving this recommendation to you. What could you look at in your life to come up from the surface or come down from the mountain to be on the earth as a leader with this Father energy? And then go back to Ned Stark. He was willing to be the one to execute. If he gave the order down from the quote unquote mountain that justice had to be served and it had to be executed, he was the one that picked up the sword to actually do it. He was a leader that was a Zeus-like character of the sky, but he came down to earth to do the execution himself because it meant a lot to him. It was important to him that he got his hands dirty and he was engaging directly with the earth, not just giving commands from on high. So whatever that means for you, whatever one of these energies you might possess and express, take that metaphor and apply it to your life in however that might look for growth for you. And I think that you're going to show up as an incredible Father energy if you are able to do that, connect it to the real world, connect that energy to something that can be tangible, can be practical, can be pragmatic in your life and the people you lead. So this was the first part of the next several parts of the Gods in Every Man, and we've been talking for a while here. I mean, you've been here with us, but you don't have a microphone on your side, right? So what we need you to do right now is go over to personalityhacker.com and express yourself. Give us your feedback. Tell us your story. Ask your questions. Start a conversation with us here at Personality Hacker. Directly below this show, there's comments there. You can engage there. You can also engage in our community of like minds, people just like you that are growing, learning more about themselves, about each other, about the world at large. You can find us on Facebook.com/personalityhacker, Twitter.com/personalityhack. We're also on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel that we're adding to more frequently now, so you can also watch videos and go subscribe there, youtube.com/personalityhacker. All sorts of places to find us. The best place to start is personalityhacker.com, but we do want to engage with you on whatever social media platform is your preferred platform.
And if you would like to know how to support Personality Hacker, one of the best ways to do it is to go check out our premium programs, see if there's a personal development program right for you, and in that way you invest in yourself, and also you can help us keep making these podcasts, even these incredibly long ones like today's one. I have no idea how long it is, but I have a feeling this is one of the longest ones we've ever done. I wonder how much of that length was spent in making caveats about how good father energy can be and don't demonize it. I don't know how much was spent in that, but I feel passionate about that. I feel like let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. What do you think?
Don't throw dad out on the stretcher.
That's right. Don't throw the dad out with all the corrupt political and corporate regimes.
To be quite honest, how I feel about that is it is frustrating that a conversation, it has to go down that road for me to feel so defensive of that energy and feel like apologies have to be made. It does feel, again, it comes down to how Bolen expresses it in her book a lot. But I think it's frustrating to me as somebody that identifies a lot of that energy to say, oh, I feel like I got to just, and this goes back to, again, my Christian days, right? I had to show up. I wasn't sinful and bad and wrong for what I did. I was sinful, bad, and wrong for who I was. You know, I was born sinful into a sinful world, and it was very frustrating for me to have to get over that, to like come to grips with that. And I kind of feel like this too. It's almost like I have to make an apology for the energy I show up with. I show up with this energy, and especially in today's world, I believe there's a hostility toward it. And I almost feel frustrated that I do feel frustrated that I have to run out and make apology for who I am.
Yeah.
Like that's challenging for me, and I struggle with it.
Maybe we didn't, though. Like, wouldn't it be crazy if people were like, you didn't have to do that at all? And for some reason, we felt the need to do it. But I think, and we're still doing it way after the outro. Like the outro, and we're still doing it. This is like the bookend at the end. It's really kind of fascinating. It's like studying ourselves doing this podcast is a fascinating thing to me.
My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast, where we're going to start talking about the sun energies, and we're going to start detailing out the sun gods, SON, sun gods. We'll see you on the next episode.